Molly. I'm the events coordinator here. Before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so please start thinking of questions to ask. And after the talk, Hugh will be signing and personalizing books at the desk near the side door where you entered. We also have additional books available for purchase tonight. And if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Women's House of Detention online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so with all that in mind, we are very excited to introduce Hugh Ryan and Rachel Corbin, who are here celebrating the release of Hugh's newest book, The Women's House of Detention. Honestly, this is one of the books that I read and then I just had to talk about it with every single person that I interacted with. The stories, the sources, the writing, I mean, it's something that just stays with you long, long after you finished it. The Women's House of Detention spotlights a long forgotten yet extremely significant part of queer history, and the research put into this book is truly astounding. Told through the personal, gripping experiences of the women and transmasculine people whose lives were forever impacted by the House of D, this book not only explains and examines this piece of history, but compels us to never forget it again. And I think, we're especially honored to be able to give space to this important conversation the night before the start of Pride Month. Hugh Ryan is a writer and curator. His first book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, won a 2020 New York City Book Award, was a New York Times Editor's Choice in 2019, and was a finalist for the Randy Schultz and Lambda Literary Awards. He was honored with the 2020 Alan Berube Prize from the American Historical Association. In 2019 through 2021, he worked on the Hidden Voices LGBTQ+ stories in United States history curricular for the NYC Department of Education. And as I mentioned before, Rachel Corbin joins Hugh in conversation tonight. Rachel is a historian of feminist and LGBTQ social movements. She received a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Stony Brook University and will begin a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto in the fall. Her research has appeared in journals such as GLQ, Feminist Formations, Histoire Sociale, Social History, and Continuum. Rachel also serves on the coordinating committee of the Lesbian History Archives and recently curated an exhibit at the LGBT Center on the wide world of lesbian cats. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Hugh and Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. I'm gonna take my mask off. I tested right before coming here. This way it'll be a little easier for y'all to hopefully understand me, and I will try not to talk a mile a minute, but I've had a lot of coffee, so no promises. But thank you everyone for coming out tonight on like a 90,000 degree day right before Pride, when I'm sure there are other fabulous queer things going on in this city. It really means a lot, especially to come and talk about the histories of incarcerated folks, which I think are often very hard to listen to, very hard to think about. So one thing I want to put out there before we begin, if for whatever reason you need to stand up and walk around, you need to take a moment, go outside, whatever you need, totally cool, please take care of yourself. You can't write about prisons without writing about violence, or it would itself be kind of an act of violence. So there is some violence in what I'm going to read tonight. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction of the book, and then we'll go into our conversation. I think the only thing you really need to know is the Women's House of Detention was a prison that stood in Greenwich Village for most of the majority of the mid-20th century. So started being built in 1929, torn down in 1974. So with that, I'm going to read from the introduction. J. Toole marks the land. The Jefferson Market Garden in Greenwich Village is one of the loveliest places I can't stand. Flowering season seems to last longer there than the rest of the city. The low-rise nature of the surrounding buildings allows precious sun to warm the ground for Lenten roses in the first weeks of March, and it keeps the garden inviting until the last camellias drop their petals in November. The only potential reminder of the spot's 150-year history as a prison is the high steel fence, which these days keeps the unwanted riffraff out rather than in. I used to love this garden. I'd sit by the koi pond, do interviews on my cell phone, and think what a beautiful oasis it was. What a gift the village had given the city. Now, I can't look at it without hearing J. Toole's voice describing the brutal physicals that doctors had inflicted upon her there, when the garden was a prison called the Women's House of Detention. When I go into the garden, I'm always brought back to this one time. It happened many, many times, but this one stands out. He's telling me to get on the table, put my feet in the stirrups, and this and that, and it felt like his whole arm went in there, you know? And they checked everywhere. Every hole you had, that's where they went. And he was like, all right, get off the table. Hurry up. We got to get the next one in. Hurry up? I couldn't move. The pain was so bad, and I don't know what he did up in there, but it was so bad. When I looked down, I was covered in blood. And they didn't do nothing. Today, it's hard to imagine that a prison once graced the rarefied streets of Greenwich Village, one of New York City's most picturesque and unaffordable neighborhoods. But for almost as long as there has been a Greenwich Village, which is to say, almost as long as there has been a United States, detention centers have been an integral part of village life. The last of them, the Women's House of Detention, stood from 1929 to 1974. It was one of the village's most famous landmarks, a meeting place for locals and a must-see site for adventurous tourists. And for tens of thousands of arrested women and trans-masculine people from every corner of the city, the House of D was a nexus, drawing the threads of their lives together in its dark and fearsome cells. Some were imprisoned there once, for as little as a day. Others returned often and were held for years at a time. For decades, upon their release, these women navigated the streets of Greenwich Village, ate in its automats and diners, caroused in the bars that would let them in, lived in nearby tenements, slept rough in the parks, visited friends and loved ones who were on trial or in detention, worked what jobs would hire them, attended court-mandated health screenings and probation meetings, and in a million and one other ways, made the village their own. Now, aside from a small plaque on the garden's fence, they've been almost entirely forgotten. Almost. The slim few who have fought to preserve the memory of the House of D are mostly working-class lesbian and bisexual women and trans-masculine folks, the people most likely to fall into its clutches and least likely to have other landmarks to call their own. J. Toole first ended up in the orbit of the House of D when she was 13, in 1960. Some friends had given her the haircut every cool boy wanted, a tight fade flat top, just like Steve McQueen and Mickey Mantle. That was the final straw for her father, a violent, sexually abusive man who ruled their Bronx home with his fists. That night he threw her out, and Jay lived among the queer kids on the streets of the village for the next 25 years. At the age when most of her peers started high school, Jay started heroin. In 1964, she stole a taxi to drive a girlfriend to California, but they only made it as far as Texas before they were caught, and Jay was sentenced to her first bid in the House of D. A lot of us called it the playground. A lot of us called it the prison. I called it both, Jay told historians in 2016, depending on what I was arrested for and how much I got. For Jay, the prison was complicated. Dangerous, vile, violent, dirty, cruel. But also a place where she met other queer people, and one of the centers of her queer community. She and other butches would hang out in the shadow of the prison at Wayland's drugstore on 6th Avenue, where they could watch the tide of arrested women flow in and out of the prison's high stone walls. Most of the people she met inside are gone now, dead or just disappeared. But Jay keeps their memories alive. Since the early 2000s, she's organized tours of the West Village to share the queer history of the House of D because, quote, young people don't know about it. The landmark is gone, but Jay marks the land, exposing the grim roots beneath the garden's manicured paths. And make no mistake, the House of D was a queer landmark. In truth, all prisons are, especially ones intended for women. Today, approximately 40% of people incarcerated in women's detention facilities are part of the broad LGBTQ spectrum. 40%, compared to about 3.5% of the general population. That percentage is based on in-person interviews with over 100,000 currently detained people. And researchers only identified someone as a sexual minority if they themselves identified that way verbally in the interview, or if they had sexual relationships with people of the same sex before being incarcerated. We can only speculate how high the percentage would have been had the study counted those who could not talk openly about their sexual identities, or if it included those who had same-sex relationships while incarcerated. We live in the age of mass incarceration. If we extrapolate those findings to the nearly 250,000 currently incarcerated people in America, at least 100,000 of them are queer. And that's after decades of LGBTQ, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-prison activism, which have supposedly made our criminal legal system more fair. During the years the House of D was active, which spanned the single most homophobic period in American history, the percentage of queer people it encaged was most certainly higher. How much, we'll never know for sure. But records show that queer women and transmasculine people were sentenced to the House of D for such crimes as smoking, forgery, petty larceny, being homeless, attempting suicide, murder, wearing pants, sending the definition of the word lesbian through the mail, associating with idle or vicious persons, staying out late, accepting a ride from a man, vagrancy, alcoholism, prostitution, possession of narcotics, waywardism, disobedience, stealing rare books, being alone on the street at night, rape, drug addiction, and lesbianism itself. Yet the impacts of queer people on prison history and the impacts of prisons on queer history are rarely examined. And even when they are, it's mostly about men. But thanks to its age, size, and unique history as an early adopter of penal innovations, New York City, quote, offers a unique perspective on how the rehabilitation of female criminal behavior developed as a distinct reform enterprise. That's according to Cheryl Hicks, the author of Talk With You Like a Woman, African American Women, Justice, and Reform in New York. Furthermore, over the course of the 20th century, New York City went from having a 98% white population to a 44% white population. Major demographic shifts like the Great Migration, the immigration of black people from the Caribbean, post-World War II anti-urban white flight, and the influx of Puerto Rican people due to the economic devastation of American colonial capitalism have had formative effects on our city and our prisons and the way we treat the people incarcerated in them. Thus, New York's penal institutions for women offer unique insights into how racism, classism, xenophobia, and homophobia intertwine with misogyny to create public policy and ruin human lives. And the House of D, more than perhaps any other prison, had an outsized role in queer life. It sat at the end of Christopher Street, the block whose very name is a global byword for queerness. You could see the Stonewall Inn from the prison's high, small windows. And during the Stonewall Uprising, those on the inside held a riot all their own, setting fire to their belongings and tossing them out the windows while screaming, "Gay rights! Gay rights! Gay rights!" Yet still in 2016, the New York Times would refer to the uprising as being all gay men, and only grudgingly issue a correction stating there was, quote, at least one lesbian involved. One! You get one. Jay Toole, a Stonewall vet herself, could have told them that, if only they had bothered to ask. The House of D helped make Greenwich Village queer, and the village in return helped define queerness for America. No other prison has played such a significant role in our history, particularly for working class women and transmasculine people. For them, as pioneering historian Joan Nessel, founder of the Lesbian History Archives, once wrote, the House of D was, quote, a constant presence in our lives, a warning, a beacon, a reminder, and a moment of community. Many, perhaps most formerly incarcerated people talk rarely about their experiences, and many, perhaps most, non-incarcerated people refuse to listen when they do. At most, we get data about people in prison, aggregated statistics that reduce them down to fungible numbers, not human beings with specific thoughts and experiences. As Nicole Hahn Rafter wrote in the preface to Partial Justice, Women, Prisons, and Social Control, like others who have attempted to study prisoners of the past, I was constantly frustrated by lack of information on individual inmates. In the 30 years since Rafter wrote her book, little has changed. In the introduction to a 2015 study of prisons in early America, Jen Mannion wrote that, quote, without diaries or letters written by the women themselves, I accepted that I would never really know what they thought, or felt, or strived for. And Mannion bemoaned, quote, how incomplete our understanding of state authority has been without attention to the actions, thoughts, and experiences of those subjected to its reach. The bulk of the work of this book has been to undo those silences, to find and follow the lives of imprisoned women and transmasculine people, and to allow revelations about the Women's House of Detention, Greenwich Village, queer history, and prisons generally to arise from their lives, their ideas, their stories. This is the biography of a unique building, but the building only matters because of the people who passed through it. By reconstructing the experiences of hundreds of incarcerated New Yorkers, I've identified a representative few whose lives were particularly well documented. They have acted as the Beatrices for my descent into what one prison social worker called the hellhole that was the House of D. When I began sketching out the idea for this book 5 years ago, I had a naive understanding that prisons were bad and should be made better. I might even have described them as broken. But to look at prisons historically is to see a monstrously efficient system doing exactly what it was designed to do: hide every social problem we refuse to deal with. Prisons have very little to do with justice or rehabilitation. If they did, we would care about the 83% recidivism rate for people currently incarcerated in state prisons. Or we would be up in arms about the fact that 200,000 people are sexually assaulted while incarcerated every single year. And that's not even counting those who are violated by the routine procedures of healthcare in prisons and jails, or those who never report being assaulted out of fear or shame or simple recognition that the system does not care. If 1 in 12 people sentenced to prison were also sentenced to be raped for their crimes, we would call that barbaric. But when 1 in 12 people is sexually violated as collateral damage to their imprisonment, we call that justice. As noted abolitionist, author, and community organizer Mariam Kaba writes in her brilliant book, We Do This Till We Free Us, calls for prison reform, quote, ignore the reality that an institution grounded in the commodification of human beings through torture and the deprivation of their liberty cannot be made good. Cages confine people, not the conditions that facilitated those harms or the mentalities that perpetuate justice. Justice deals with root causes. Punishment and confinement do not. For that reason, following the example of Kaba and other abolitionists, I use the phrase criminal legal system instead of criminal justice system. Most people in detention are there because they are poor, black, female, queer, gender nonconforming, brown, mentally ill, chemically addicted, indigenous, abandoned by their families in the state, or some combination of the above. Discussions of crime are a distraction from this reality. Many abolitionists thus differentiate crime, the violation of specific statutes, many of which are inherently unjust, from harm, a violation inflicted on a person by another person or by the state, which must be redressed for true justice to exist, but which is often considered perfectly legal. Criminal detention almost always leads to increased harm, for the person incarcerated, for those who depend on them, and for the communities they come from. The only twisted sense in which detention creates less harm is if we disregard the humanity of those incarcerated and their communities and focus solely on an incarcerated person's potential to harm someone the system actually cares about, usually a white person of some means or a business. Researching the House of D has shown me the consistency of this truth over decades, through liberal moments and conservative ones. The prison system is irredeemable. These detention warehouses are stopgaps and pressure valves for every other system that actually is broken, from education to mental health care. And without fundamental change, any minor reform to the prison system is simply overwhelmed over time by these realities. But through this research, I also began to see connections between abolition and my hopes for the queer movement writ large. Abolition moves us away from a paradigm of legal versus illegal, and toward one of harm versus what? To me, the opposite of harm is care, the thing we owe one another, the thing we cannot live without, the thing the government should take a vested and financial interest in promoting. Yet we starve our systems of care while we feed the beast of incarceration. Our social safety net, from healthcare to the shelter system to welfare, is badly frayed. And our government has confused promoting a specific family type, heterosexual and nuclear, with promoting interpersonal care generally. I had many criticisms of the movement for gay marriage. I'm a real hater. But at the most fundamental, my frustration was this. It accepted unquestioningly the idea that certain kinds of sexual relationships deserve to be rewarded. The government has no fundamental interest in my sex life. It does, however, have a vested interest in seeing that we are cared for. The uncared for person ends up on the street, in the emergency room, in foster care, in asylums, in nursing homes, and all too often, in prison. The uncared for person costs the state time and money, one way or another. Marriage law is a clumsy, limited solution to this problem, an attempt to promote relationships of care in hopes that this work will not end up on the state. Why unnecessarily limit it to pairs of people who like each other's genitals? Why not extended families? Why not friends? Why not sexual relationships beyond monogamy? A need for care connects so many parts of the broad queer agenda. What do families abandoned by their parents? What do children abandoned by their families need? Care. What do elders without descendants need? Care. What is the support to form a chosen family? What is access to medically safe, socially supported gender transition services? What did the AIDS crisis show our government's lack of? What do LGBTQ immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers need? Care, care, care. Because queerness is not a vertical identity. So long as our society sees personal care as something that should mainly come from the nuclear family, there will always be queer people in need of care. In 1998, Jay Toole got sick. She couldn't walk for a while. Some friends on the street took Jay to a shelter, where she got sober and connected with a woman who brought her to the LGBT center. At first, Jay thought, fuck no, I'm not going to that place. I used to sleep outside of it in the front when it first opened, and they chased me off. But she went. And at the meeting, they were talking about welfare, about substance use, about homelessness, and she kept thinking, that's me, that's me, that's me. For once, they were talking about her. So she talked too. I don't know how, but the microphone ended up in my hand. I got up and I started telling them what I thought they needed to do, coming from the shelter system, and that there's so many of us in there, and no one knows about it. And I haven't fucking shut up yet. In 2002, recognizing the limitations in the liberal LGBTQ movement, that group became Queers for Economic Justice, an anti-poverty advocacy group with a queer lens. For the next 12 years, Jay Toole was the director of their shelter program, which advocated for queer homeless people. Thanks to her work with QEJ, New York City allows shelter residents to self-determine whether they want to be placed in men's or women's facilities, and they recognize domestic partners on an equal plane with married couples. But despite all she's done on behalf of so many others, however, Toole's future is still insecure. I'd say I feel discouraged by what our community is not doing, she told an interviewer in 2011. I wonder what's going to happen to me when I won't be able to work or do anything. Who will take care of us? These are the questions abolition asks. Who is harmed? Who is cared for? And where is the state putting its thumb on the scale? The vast changes that our system needs cannot happen all at once. But every step we take must be in the direction of our ultimate goal of true liberation. As Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, once said, I believe that reform must be integrated with revolution. Reforms are all right. Reforms are good, so long as they don't put up an obstacle to your final revolutionary goal. We must make very sure that our reforms are well thought out, and that we explain to the people on the way the significance, and also the dangers, of accepting certain compromises. I am not an organizer. I do not have the answers, and you will not find them in this book. But by looking closely at the history of the Women's House of Detention, I can clearly see the development of our modern system of mass incarceration, how it has affected queer people in our communities, and just how little justice there is in it. In writing this book, I have lost a garden and gained a new vision for the world. Thank you.
Thank
you, Hugh. It's always so great to hear you read. So I wanted to start by asking you about how this book relates to some of your earlier work, both when Brooklyn was queer and also your public history work. What are some kind of common things that propel a lot of your historical research, and what is perhaps different about this project?
In some ways, it comes directly out of my previous book. When Brooklyn Was Queer follows a number of people who ended up in the Women's House of Detention, some of whom I didn't even know that until I started doing the research. There's a person that I follow who was arrested in 1917 in Brooklyn for wearing pants and smoking in a cafe. At the time, I was only able to find his dead name, so I knew his last name was Trondle, but I didn't know the first name that he lived by. When I started researching the Women's House of Detention, I found a file, hundreds of pages long, that documented the rest of his life, the number of times he was in and out of the institution, how he lived, how he died. Connections like that came up throughout researching the book. So there were those kind of like direct connections to my work, but there were also bigger sort of theoretical questions relating to When Brooklyn Was Queer again. In that book, I talked about prisons as a site for queer history, but primarily as a place that recorded queer history, because they were arresting people, not thinking yet about how these prisons actually produce queer community, but how they produce records. So I knew that prisons were an issue that I was interested in and that they were related to queer history, but I didn't exactly know everything that I was going to come to find through this. But in terms of the larger picture about my public history, one of the questions that I'm always trying to ask myself is, what is it that should be in our public memory but does not seem to be, right? So the Brooklyn book was a really obvious example. I had lived in Brooklyn for over a decade. My family was from the Bronx. I was a women's studies major. I was doing these pop-up Museum of Queer History shows. And one morning I woke up and said, wait, I know absolutely nothing about the history of the city that I live in. And as I started to ask people, I realized they didn't know either. We, with the Pop-Up Museum, used to do these locally sourced shows. We put out call for proposals. Everywhere else, we put out a call. People would be like, oh, I know so much about my city. I want to tell you. In Brooklyn, it was like crickets, you know? And that same energy brought me to the House of D. Once I had sort of thought about it a little bit because of the folks from my previous book, Jay Toole, who is so prominently featured, I went on a tour with her of the West Village, and she talked about the House of D and how central it was to her life. And I was like, the fuck? How could I not know that there was a 12-story prison right here? And then the more people I talked to, the fewer people I knew about it. And as I started to find the folks who were incarcerated there in the 60s and 70s who were still alive, they said to me, we feel like we've been forgotten. Not just our individual existence, but the thing that gave them context. And that is like my catnip as a historian, right? These important things that feel so central in a certain way, and then are allowed to be suppressed and removed from the story of our city, of our history. So those are some of the ways. I'm sure there's like a million more that I can't remember right now.
Yeah, so this is kind of related to what you were already discussing about archives. The book is based upon a ton of different sources, both published and archival, and also oral history and reviews. But one of the kind of like centerpieces of the sources is the Women's Prison Administration records. So I have kind of like, how did you discover this question? And then also, if you could talk through some of both what you learned from that collection and also some of the limitations of it.
Yeah, the WPA records are fascinating. WPA is still around. They are an organization. They were the first organization in the country to work specifically with formerly incarcerated women. They founded in the mid-1800s when they split off from another organization that still exists, the Prison Association of New York. The WPA had social workers, and they also were more progressive than most similar organizations in New York. And so they funded staff at the prison because they recognized that incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people were getting abandoned the moment they walked out the door. So they thought if they funded psychologists and social workers in the prison that the city refused to fund, they would be able to establish some kinds of like a coherency of care. It did not work out that way. Like most of these organizations that exist to serve formerly incarcerated people, they were also very punitive in their own sense, but they were more progressive than similar organizations. And so their files are robust and amazing, and they were given to the New York Public Library in the 1980s, and no one has ever looked at them since. Not once, not anyone. 160-something boxes. And the reason is this: when they were donated, the organization wanted to protect the people inside them, which I totally understand. They said, any file less than 70 years old, you have to get permission to look at it. but they gave the files in alphabetical order, not chronological order. And the library assumed that every box had at least one file that was less than 70 years old and locked them away forever. So no one had ever thought to ask for permission because nobody even knew the organization was still around, it seemed like. But they did. They said, I had permission, and they said, do what you want, look at everything, quote what you want, we don't think you'll find any queer people. And within the first hour I was there, I found a 500-page file that followed a woman for 40 years. And I was like, oh my God, this is everything I have been looking for. Because when I had the idea for this book, so going back to your other part of your question, the first question I had for myself was, how do I tell this in a way that isn't just based off of prison records, which are fallible and biased and treat incarcerated people like numbers, right? They're not people. They're raw material for someone else's conclusions. And I knew I couldn't base a book off of that. It wouldn't be a book I was interested in, and it would miss the essential part of the prison. What made it important was the people who came through it, not the building or the administration. They were an accident of destiny, right? The people were what mattered. So I spent a year trying to figure out where I could find those stories. I started off looking at the records of early LGBTQ organizations, then I tried every LGBTQ periodical or newsletter, then I tried famous queer people who had their own archives who were in New York at the right time, and I really didn't come up with much. I would find mentions. Audre Lorde points to it in Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name. Joe Nessel writes about it in The Persistent Desire, but a paragraph here, 2 sentences there. I had to sit back down at that point and say to myself, maybe I can't write this book. I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't find these things. Where are they? Where would they be? And what I came down to was, I think there are 2 ways you end up in the public archive, right? That you end up in the records. Either you have power, and you're able to preserve your own story. You're famous and people want to write about you. You own your own home, and so you can put your diaries in the attic and you have descendants who will take care of them. Or you are so famous you can publish your own book and your own story. Or people have power over you, right? That's the other way we end up in the archive. And in that case, I thought that's how these people would have ended up there. Where, in a situation where someone had power over them, would someone ask the kind of questions I'm interested in hearing the answers to? And that's when I hit on social workers. Because particularly in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, they believed there was a real intertwining between being queer, being incarcerated, being the wrong kind of women, and being unable to economically support yourself. Right? The whole idea was that women needed to be incarcerated for a wide range of things that weren't crimes because those things showed them to be sexually disreputable. And if you weren't appropriately feminine, you were never going to be a wife and you were never going to be a maid. And that meant you would never be able to support yourself. So the women's prison system is really a forced feminization project that focuses on poor people because they are considered not appropriately feminine. So I thought social workers working with formerly incarcerated people would at least be asking the right kinds of questions, whether or not they preserved the answers in a way that was useful to me. And as soon as I got into those records, I knew that it was a gold mine. And I should say, before the pandemic hit, was only able to go through maybe a third of the collection. There is so much more there to be found.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So I'm interested also in your book. One of the, I think the important themes of it is it's looking at kind of like small scale forms of resistance that happened before organized activist movements. So especially with like Pride coming up and like the story that gets retold with Pride, how does your book challenge kind of popularly held assumptions about the history of queer activism?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think in 2 really important ways. So first, dealing with Pride, I'll talk about the really fun one. When I started doing this research, I had heard stories through people that there was some kind of activism in the prison that night, on the first night of Stonewall. But as I did the research, I discovered a couple of people. Arcus Flynn, who's still alive, who talks about how she was driving through the West Village, coming home from her night job as a nurse, when she started to notice these little points of light flying through the sky. And she pulled over her car because she couldn't figure out what they were. And she got out and she heard yelling. And so she followed it, and she realized it was people in the house of detention setting fire to their belongings and throwing them out the windows while screaming gay rights, because they could see Stonewall. They were 500 feet away. When we talk about what happened at the Stonewall uprising, if you move the camera a half an inch over to the side, there is a whole other riot going on by people who are already incarcerated, already arrested, already in danger from the system. And we talk about how brave those people were at the Stonewall, and they were. But think about how brave these women and transmasculine people were, resisting when they were already in cages. We know very little about those folks. We know they existed, and thanks to a single article in the New York Age, which is a really important black newspaper that came out about a week later, we know that what the prison says is that officially on that night, 7 women tried to escape. We have their names, we have their mugshots. We know basically nothing else about them, what their connection was to what was happening, whether these were the women who were also protesting and throwing things out the window, or a different group of women using that as a sort of excuse or a moment to try and escape. All of this has been largely ignored historically, even though authors like Rita Mae Brown has been telling this story basically since Stonewall happened. Every single year, Rita Mae Brown telling this story, people not listening. So in that sense, this book is very directly connected to the activism that was happening then and is happening now. In a broader sense, one of the things that I really realized as I was reading this is that every time I hear about one of the big famous lights of queer activism of the 20th century, whether that's Harry Hay or Barbara Giddings or Frank Kameny, like the folks who did the organized homophile movements, who did all of this work, you listen to their own words and they say, oh, the first place where I found out that it was okay to be a queer person, that queer people were normal, were the bars, right? These ideas that they had weren't new to them. They were ideas they had because they were hanging out with folks who were already so far outside the charmed circle of American life that they could be queer and accept themselves and accept each other because they had these spaces. Sure, they were disreputable and run by the mob and literally in the shadows of the elevated trains, but they were places where they could imagine life outside of the sort of cis, hetero, white patriarchy, which I think is something that we know from the Black liberation tradition, right? We talk about freedom dreaming, the ability of people communally to come to answers they cannot when they are alone, because when you're alone, you could be wrong, you could be a mistake, you could be crazy. But when there's 20 or 30 or 50 or 1,000 of you all saying the same thing, then you are oppressed, right? And that, I think, is so much the story of this book. These women and transmasculine people transformed the streets of Greenwich Village by their very presence, by being working class people who did not have private space in which to conduct and hide their queer lives. They had to do it on the street, as is the case in every neighborhood still to this day in America. If you go there, the people on the street who give it the queer vibe are young people who don't have private space. They're poor people who don't have private space. They're tourists. They're folks who need to act out their queer lives on the street. And that's why the village has retained the character that it has, because for so long it had places like the House of D, or the piers, or the trucks on the West Side Highway, held all of the West Side Highway. And those places have been systematically destroyed. But the street life that they encouraged is what gave the village its queer reputation, and what the village then gave to the world, right? That becomes the center of what it means to be queer in the 20th century. That in San Francisco, East Coast Center, let's say. And that vibe was created by these women and trans men.
So we have one last question, and then I'll open it to the audience. So you close your book by saying that for every one story that you include, I think there's 50 stories that you were not able to include. So what is your favorite story that didn't really fit into your book
there are
project?
so many. Every time I'm asked this question, I try to come up with a different answer. So today, there were 2 sisters in the 1950s. They were both from Puerto Rico. They were young. I think one was maybe in her late teens, the other one in her early 20s. One of them was arrested in New York for soliciting, though as she said, lots of people were arrested for soliciting. It was kind of like the most common charge if you were a woman. In the 1930s, they ruled that soliciting had nothing to do with exchanging sex for money. It was, in fact, just the common lewdness of women. So anyone literally could be arrested as a sex worker in New York City if you were considered a woman. So she's arrested for that. And while she's there, they start talking to her at the social work service place, the Women's Prison Association, after she's incarcerated. And she doesn't like it. She doesn't stay around for long. The reason she's not in the book is that her file is really short. But at one point, she gets into a fight with a bunch of them, and she's explaining that her sister is in jail, and they're like, why? And all she will say is that she's in jail for being a lesbian. and she can't, and like she gets into a fight with a whole bunch of people there who are like, she deserves it, and then she just disappears. And I've always wondered what their story was, if they ever, were able to reconnect, or where they went after that. But these two young women, in the like late 50s, early 60s, they're like 19-year-old working class women fighting to be queer and protecting each other, and I think so much of the story of these people is that the ones looking out for them are each other. So their story was amazing, but like a lot of the stories I found in the Women's Prison Association files, I have 2 pages, 6 months, 3 social work visits, half of a medical record, 1 high school transcript, and that's it, just those details. So it's more than I had before, but not enough that they could make it into the book.
I think you described it as a little pile of papers
Yeah.
at one point.
It's just like a little, and sometimes in the files there are amazing things. Some of these files had photos. I found love letters. I found wedding rings. I found college transcripts, high school transcripts, poetry these women had written, the names of albums that they had sang on that I tried to hunt down. Anything you can imagine shows up in these files, but it does not all show up in the book. Thank you for asking really great questions and for doing this at all. Those of you who have not previously had the chance to interact with Rachel, she is an incredible historian, has been a leading light for me in my own work, and through your work with the Lesbian History Archives has literally made this kind of research possible. So I want to turn it over to questions in a second, but first I just want to give a hand to Rachel because it meant so much.
So you mentioned earlier when you were speaking that you didn't find much in the contemporary queer press about the Women's House of D. And is that true sort of for conversations about incarcerated queer folks across the board, or is the Women's House of Detention sort of like a specific like lacuna?
I will say that I found a lot more about men in most recent discourse. What I found generally was that in the last few years, there is a lot more being produced about queer people and prisons.
So I'm a contemporary in the like historian.
Oh, okay. That's okay. That's what I was about to say. When I said contemporary, what I was trying to say, thank you, I'm glad. Okay, we're on the same page. Yeah. No, there was at most what you would find was discussions of particularly queer crimes. So things where it's like, was it de jure? That's the one that's in the law, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's like written that we are arresting a gay man, or that this is obscenity. There's kind of this like a liberal approach to queer rights that emerges really, it's there before Stonewall, I shouldn't say it emerges, but we have this moment, there's a very liberatory moment in 1969 that looks at incarceration as something that could happen to you because you were queer, not because the policeman arrested you as a lesbian, but because you were queer and gender nonconforming, so you were forced out of your school system, so you ended up poor. In those moments, we get a little bit of a deeper discussion about how folks end up in prison, and we get a little more about the Women's House of Detention, the Gay Liberation Front, the Radical Lesbians, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords. They all focused on the prison as a site of occupation, resistance, community organizing. But once the prison closes in 1971, that basically goes away, and the conversation really does stay around men who've been arrested for being gay, with maybe a little bit of some prison pen pal activism in the like mid-70s. But yeah, the House of D very quickly falls out of the conversation.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So Mabel Hampton's oral histories are both featured in both of your books. Do you have any other figures in sort of queer New York history that could be sort of as prominent as Mabel Hampton, or ones that you actually want to write about in the future?
Mabel is amazing. Mabel Hampton, if you don't know about her, was a queer black woman, a lesbian organizer who lived in New York from, I believe, 1908. Is that right?
I think that sounds right.
1908 until the mid-1980s. She was the Grand Marshal of the New York City Pride Parade in 85. And one of the people who helped create, really, the Lesbian History Archives. She was very close to Joan Nessel. And her papers are there. And Joan did this oral history, series of oral histories. Joan, Deb Edel, who's one of the other co-founders of the Lesbian History Archives, a few other folks. And they interviewed Mabel Hampton many times in the 70s and 80s, producing this incredibly robust record about like being a queer woman dancing in shows at the Harlem Renaissance and at Coney Island, and being arrested and sent to Bedford Hills, and then being, an air raid warden in the Bronx during World War II, and finding the love of her life. And it's incredible records, and there really is not anything, I think, comparable about a single person in New York. Would you think?
No.
Yeah. And they're so stellar. They're so amazing. In terms of myself and what kind of like people I'm interested in right at this particular moment, I'm not good if I don't have a project. So when I put down the research writing side of this about a year ago, I was asked to start doing some interviews with folks who were involved in the Lower East Side avant-garde of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, who similarly have sort of said to me, we feel like we're being forgotten, and many of us are still alive right now. So that's what I've been doing for the last year, talking with everyone from Jane County, the original like trans rock pioneer from the 60s who influenced and toured with David Bowie, to folks like Sarah Schulman, who we were just discussing, the playwright, novelist, writer, activist, everything. So those are some folks that I'm interested in right now, but there isn't anyone who I would say is comparable to Mabel Hampton's archives. There is, I will say, we're sort of still figuring this out, but I have been working with SAGE, the organization in Manhattan, to help them with an oral history that they have had in their collection for many years that they are trying to get a wider listening to. So I'm very excited about those because similar to the Mabel Hampton tapes, it's someone being interviewed over and over again, so you get a lot more of a robust picture than these kind of little one-offs. But I haven't listened to those tapes yet.
Thank you.
But you found them.
But yes, they did not have anything about the Women's House of Detention. Yeah. The whole reason I was hunting these tapes down is that I found a piece of paper that said there was an oral history done specifically about the Women's House of Detention in the 1980s between Columbia and SAGE. But it turns out the oral history was never funded, and so the whole project, after the lists of questions were developed, it was abandoned. So I spent years hunting down what I thought was going to be these tapes. I found so many other oral history collections, which is great. Very happy to have found them. Not what I needed.
So I was wondering, what's the next area of queer history you'd be interested in researching, or you think might be generally the most important, or
There's a big set of questions. I'll say, so I do think this Lower East Side project is probably my next project, but something I'm really interested in, possibly because of my age, is that I think there's kind of this really interesting memory hole that starts in the early 80s and goes through the early 2000s, right? It's not old enough to be history that we've been really interested in preserving and looking at, but it's also not new enough that it's digitally native and really easy to access. And I myself was a teenager in the 90s and feel that that was very formative to my own experiences. So I think there's some really interesting stuff to be done there. I also am particularly interested in the ways in which ideas around what it means to be trans have changed over that period. I often joke that I'm old enough to remember that the original subtitle to Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors was From Joan of Arc to RuPaul. And I think that's enough to say like how drastically our conceptions of what it means to be trans have changed in just those 40 years. So that's something I'm particularly interested in personally, but I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to actually research it.
can I add on to that? Do you think there's anything, I guess, for society in general would be very important for us to know in terms of queer history?
Oh my gosh, everything. I mean, I think my big takeaway, the one that I always think is the most important part, is that I cannot predict the future. I have no idea what is going to happen 100 years from now. But I can look at the past. And when you look at queer history, you see that it's not just that how queer people are treated has changed over that time, but the very idea of what it means to be a queer person, who counts and who doesn't count as queer, has vastly shifted since the 1800s, just in America, right? And that distance and that growth and that change allows me to say that maybe I don't know what's coming, but it's possible to change, right? I think that history gives me perspective on the future and allows me to believe that activism can actually make effects, have reasons, continue to get up in the morning and have hope, you know? That's what history gives to me. Not specific like gaze of the past, but the possibility for the future. Any other? I don't know where we are. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in like the construction and evolution of identity and identity politics, and I was wondering like how you think about and navigate issues of identity and terminology, and how you think about like which terms to use in your writing.
So important. Absolutely crucial when you're doing history, because it can be very easy to use a term that you think you have a definition for, but your readers might not, and your historical subjects might have another definition for.
I think like it's so important to think about not putting our own understanding of identity onto people in the past, and like looking at it and like on their own terms.
Yeah, I agree. On their own terms, I think is one of the most important things, because that means you have to get into their heads and sort of understand how they understand the world and themselves, which is what we want to learn out of history. My biggest thing, I tell everyone, I'm not an identitarian history. My history is materialist. I actually think identity is a very weak place from which to start doing history work, because it's just not stable, right? I don't know what your identity is. You could tell me right now what your identity is, and tomorrow say something different, and because of the nature of this room and our relationship with one another, both things can be true, right? Or you could develop and change as a person, and your identity is something different. I can't know that about historical figures. Even if I have a piece of paper on which they have written, I am a gay man, well, when in their life did they write that? Where, in terms of their process, was that written? Who was coercing them to write this document? We never know those answers. So I work from a materialist history that says I can see evidence of same-sex desire, I can see evidence of cross-gender behaviors, I can understand that in your cultural context, this moment in the 1870s, what to me is a behavior that seems gender neutral is not. Right? So I try to follow that and be very upfront about it. I say very clearly, this book starts with a note on language, explaining that I use queer in an ahistorical sense, not that queer was not used that way. We have records of queer being used the way we use it today, going back to the 1820s in England, right? But certainly the people I'm talking about were probably not using the word queer, but I use it for specific reasons, and so I define those reasons in the book. And as I go into the reasons I use other words, I define those as well. One of the central parts in the 1950s chapter is a look at this sort of breakdown moment between a young black woman who's living in public housing and being evicted. Her husband is in jail, she has this girlfriend, and she's seeing these social workers. Social worker is homophobic, but trying to be supportive. She often has conversations with this woman about her girlfriend, trying to convince her that she's straight, and they have this real sticking point around language. Over and over again, the social worker uses the word bisexual in an older meaning, a sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, which means two sexes to the body, right? She, sort of what we might think as intersex today. In her meaning, though, this also means bisexual in the way that we mean it, because your body is the determiner of your personality in this schema that she's working under. Someone of two sexes is attracted to someone of both genders, right? So we can see the relationship between the words. But the younger woman who she's talking to uses it only to refer to sexuality. So when she says that her neighbor is this trans woman and she introduces her to the social worker says, is he bisexual? Which she is like, what? That's not what we're talking about. And then she tries to explain, she's like, well, I mean, she dates men for money, but she's really only into women. And the social worker is like, what? Why are you telling me that? Like, you can so clearly see that these are different ideas in their heads, but with the same word in them. So I try to talk into those moments to really drive home, not only do these ideas change, but they change irregularly, right? It's not like, okay, 1917, Freud came along and suddenly we're all using, gay instead of invert. They move and they shift, and even into the 50s, you'll have understandings that feel more like the 1890s. But we have to write these specifically into our work because you don't know who's reading it and what their frame of reference is. And for a lot of us, we didn't get taught this, right? How are we ever going to know it? So someone who's done the reading, I think it's part of our obligation in making this work legible to the people who read it, to talk about the limitations of language and the limitations of the archive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
So, if someone else has a question, I've already asked one, but cool. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, and you may touch on this in the book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but sort of the way that the carceral state and this sort of state-enforced borders have to do with it. So I'm thinking, for example, Eve Adams, who was arrested on these trumped-up obscenity charges and ended up then being deported, where of course she wasn't arrested and killed by Nazis, but just sort of the ways in which those came together in a place like the Women's House of D.
So you're talking specifically borders in terms of international?
Yeah.
Okay. It comes up in certain ways, although very limited in terms of the files that I could see. And I have a theory about that. I think the Women's Prison Association, because they were focused on helping, they worked with a select group of people who were younger, whiter, more feminine, not foreign born. I think that really skews the archive that I have, because I think that they thought that those people were not people they could assist generally. So there are some, but it's very limited. And the biggest place where it comes up actually is in the 1950s, when we start seeing more and more political prisoners being placed there, particularly socialists and communists who were arrested in part of the Smith Act trials as part of the Red Scare. They get sent there, and many of them do end up getting deported or at least forced to leave the country for a while. There's some movement back and forth between folks who are detained in the prison and detained at Ellis Island. The one thing that I can sort of slightly generalize from that, I think I did not find enough data really to be able to say too much, but certainly women of color were much more likely to be deported than white foreign-born women, even if they were being arrested for the same things under the same Smith trial case. But aside from that, excuse me, the records that I have really don't talk that much about it. Interestingly, though, I think that the way that the prison understands women and the body and the connection between being the wrong or improperly feminine kind of woman and being unable to economically support yourself is very similar to how the immigration system at the beginning of the 1900s looks at queer and intersex people. And Margot Canaday writes about that a lot in her book, The Straight State, which is a really fantastic book if anyone's kind of looking at the big picture theoreticals of how like our country has grappled with the concept of sexuality and the concept of gender. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but I didn't find them.
Thanks.
Yeah. I know that it's 8 o'clock right now, so if there are any other last questions, I think we have a few more minutes. Well, then I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out when it is 90 degrees to hear me talk about prisons, which can sometimes be a bit of a downer. So thank you all very much. Oh, and thank you to Bookstore Magic for doing this. I mean, that opening up the space, live streaming it, like selling the book, doing everything. I mean, having local bookstores matters so much. And as a Brooklynite, I love y'all. So please, if you already have my book, buy another book, buy several books, buy a gift certificate.
Yes, I'm just about to say the same exact thing. We have a bunch of copies available of The Women's House of Detention, as well as When Brooklyn Was Queer, available for purchase tonight. They will all be personalized as well. If you're still online with us on the live stream, you can go ahead and click the link in the video description to purchase those. I just want to give one last final thank you to Hugh and Rachel for having this conversation with us tonight. If you could give Hugh a few minutes just to get settled back there, and then feel free to line up for the personalizations. Other than that, I will say just be mindful of the staff so that we can clear the space and get everything set up to how it was before. But yeah, that's all. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.